The last thing my brother handed me before the men came was a tin of nails and a single sentence I did not understand for a long while. He said the hill would keep what the house could not, and then he was gone south with the wagon and the deed and the better part of everything we had, built together because the bank in Granger had decided a woman of 19 with no husband and a brother fond of card tables was a poor risk, and they were not entirely wrong about the brother. It was the fall of 1876, in the broken country east of the Sweetwater where Wyoming territory folds itself into dry coulees and red ledge, and on the morning the foreclosure rider tacked his notice to our door I owned a mule named Posey, a chocolate-colored hound named Gristle who had followed me home from a freight camp 2 winters before. An axe, a shovel, a froe, that tin of nails, and the one thing nobody could foreclose, which was everything my father had put into my hands before the lung sickness took him. They called what I did next a fool's burrow before I had moved the first barrow of earth. Stay with me, and you will see whether the men who laughed were right. I did not yet understand that the brother who left me with nothing had left me the only ground worth having. My father had been a powder man and a tunnel man in the lead diggings of the upper Mississippi before he ever came west, and he carried his trade in his forearms, and in the way he read a slope, the way other men read scripture. He never owned a school book past his 10th year. What he owned was the feel of how earth wants to sit, how it sheds water and holds heat, where it will stand on its own, and where it will come down on a careless man and bury him before he has finished his last thought. He had gone down into the ground for other men's wages since he was a boy of 11, and he had seen the ground come down on men who hurried it, and he had carried 2 of them out himself, and he never spoke of those 2 without going quiet first, so that the quiet became part of the lesson. He taught me on the washbanks behind our first claim, made me dig and shore and dig again until my hands cracked and healed and cracked, and he would crouch beside a cut I had made and lay his palm flat out against the face of it and tell me to do the same, to feel where the clay was sweating and where it was dry, because a wall that sweats is a wall that is thinking about coming down. I was 8 the first time he made me set a shore timber by myself, and I set it crooked, and he did not fix it for me. He made me kneel there in the cold mud until I saw for myself why a crooked shore is worse than no shore at all, how it teaches a person to trust a thing that will fail them, and then he had me pull it and set it true, and only then did he nod. The lessons went into me below the place where words live. The earth is patient, he would say, and it is honest, which is more than you can say for most of the men who walk on it. A wall built true will argue with you while it stands and warn you before it falls, and a man built true will do the same, and you will meet precious few of either. He died in the spring of '74 with his hand on my wrist, coughing the lead and the lung sickness up out of himself a little at a time over a hard, slow month, and at the end he could not work and could barely speak, and what he spent his last clear hour on was not comfort and not scripture, but a square he drew with his finger on the quilt over his knees, a chamber cut back into a slope, with the hard rock left for a roof, telling me without quite the breath to finish it that when I had nothing else, I would still have the hill. What he left me was not the claim, which played out, and not money, which there never was. He left me the knowing. I have come to believe the only inheritance worth. The carrying is the kind that lives in the hands, and his lived in mine, and on the cold night since I have been able to feel his palm laid flat against a clay face beside my own, telling me it was dry, telling me it would hold. The land that was left to me, if you could call a thing left when no one wanted it, was a 40-acre patch of red coulee that the brother had taken in trade for a debt and then could not sell, a fold of ground the men in Granger called the Cut, because a creek had once deep notch into the hillside and then dried up and gone, elsewhere the way creeks and men both do in that country. There was no house on it. There was a hillside of layered sandstone and packed clay facing south, a thread of seep water that ran even in August, and a wind that came down the coulee in winter the way a landlord comes for rent. Certain it is owed. The town had a name for the place and a name for me, and the name they used most was the one Harlan Voss fixed on me from the steps of the Mercantile, where he sat most afternoons with his thumbs in his vest and his opinions arranged in front of him like goods for sale. Harlan was the freight agent and the man who had bought my brother's note for 40 cents on the dollar, and he watched me load Posey with my tools and called out, loud enough for the porch, that the cut girl was off to dig herself a grave and save the county a coffin. The porch laughed. I have learned that the cruelest things are said by men who are comfortable, and Harlan was the most comfortable man in Granger. I went up the coulee with Posey and Gristle and made a camp under a canvas slung from the dead creek bank, and on the first morning I stood at the south face of that hillside for the better part of an hour and did nothing but look, which to a watching man looks like idleness, and to a tunnel man's daughter is the most important work there is. My father's voice was in me the whole time. Read the ground before you raise a hand to it. I read a seam of hard gray sandstone running back into the hill like a roof already built, and under it softer clay I could cut, and I saw that if I dug into the slope instead of building on top of it, the hill itself would be 3 of my 4 walls and most of my ceiling, and the only timber and stone I would need to find was for the front face and the door. The earth would hold the warmth a fire put into it and give it back through the night, the way the lead drifts had stayed cool in August and never frozen in January, the same earth doing the same patient work whether anyone praised it or not. I did not have the words for it that a college man would use. I had the feel of it, which had come first, and the words came after, the way they always do. I began to dig on the 3rd of October. I cut into the soft clay below the sandstone shelf and squared my chamber back into the hill, 12 feet deep and 10 wide, and I shored as I went, the way my father had drilled into me, never trusting an inch of unshored span no matter how honest the ground looked, because honest ground in the wet is a different animal than honest ground in the dry. I worked the face with the shovel where the clay was soft and the froe, and a borrowed bar where it stiffened, and I learned the seam as I went, where it ran true and where a finger of harder stone pushed down into it that I had to cut around rather than through. I left the hard gray sandstone overhead untouched and trusted it for my roof, tapping along it with the back of the axe the way my father had taught me to sound a roof, listening for the dull, true note that means solid rock and not the hollow one that means a slab ready to drop. It rang true the whole width of the chamber. Gristle lay at the lip of the cut and watched the spoil pile grow, and Posey hauled the broken stone I quarried from the ledge for the front wall, sledful by sledful down the short slope, and the days got shorter and colder, and I worked from the gray of morning to the gray of dusk, and slept hard and sore and started again. I laid the front face of stone 2 feet thick, fitting the flat ledge rock by hand and eye the way you fit a dry wall, the broad faces in and the weight settling each course down onto the one below, and I set it in a clay and lime mortar. I burned myself in a pit kiln from the limestone in the creek bed. 3 days of feeding the fire to get a half barrel of lime that I slaked and mixed with the red clay until it buttered onto the stone and held. I left a single small window on the east, no wider than my 2 hands, glazed with a pane I had carried, wrapped in a quilt the whole way from Granger, to catch the morning and give me light enough to work by without opening the door to the cold. And I built the flue with particular care, drawing it up through a natural throat in the sandstone roof at a slant rather than straight, the way my father had drawn it on the quilt with his finger, so the smoke pulled clean and the warm air did not race straight up and out behind it. but gave its heat to the stone of the throat first, and went up cooled and quiet. Every choice I made, a man in town had a name for. The slanted flue was witchery. The thick front wall was a woman who could not count her own poverty. The window was vanity, a girl wanting a looking glass onto a country that had thrown her out. They came up the coulee sometimes, 2 and 3 at a time, on the excuse of a stray cow or a fence line they suddenly needed to walk, and stood at a distance with their hands in their coats, and said these things to each other, and sometimes to me, loud enough to carry. And once a man named Tunis Hagen called down that he would not stable a hog in such a hole, and I thought, but did not say, that his hogs would be warmer than his children before the winter was out. And I kept digging. There was one among them who did not laugh, and I should name her, because the ones who do not laugh are owed remembering as much as the ones who do. Her name was Cora Pratt, a widow who kept the boarding house in Granger and had buried 2 husbands and a deal of her own softness with them. She rode up the coulee in November with a sack of dried apples and a wedge of bacon, and set them down at my fire without much in the way of speech, looked a long while at the chamber I had cut into the hill and the stone face going up across its mouth, and said only that her own father had wintered in a dugout on the Platte and lived when the men in proper houses did not, and that she had wondered her whole life why nobody else remembered it. Then she rode back down. She did not bless what I was doing, and she did not mock it. She remembered something, which in that country was rarer than charity, and she would matter more before the winter was through than either of us could have known. By the first week of December, I had a home in the hill. The chamber was dry and close and warm against cold that was settling into the coulee like water filling a basin. I had a stone hearth at the back where the sandstone made a natural chimney throat, a bed of poles and hide along one wall, shelves of plank pegged into the clay holding what little I had put by, a barrel of creek water, a sack of cornmeal, the bacon Cora had brought, and a haunch of antelope I had shot and smoked, and Gristle curled against the warm stone of the hearth, as if he had been bred for exactly that spot. I had banked earth back against the front wall to the height of the window, and let the first snows drift over the whole face of it until from 50 yards the house was only a smooth white swell in the hillside, with a thread of smoke standing out of it. A man riding past in the dark would not have known a soul lived there. I want you to hold that thought, because before the winter ended, it would be the difference between living and dying, and not for the reason you would guess. I had built a house that the eye slid off of. I had not built it for that. The earth had made it so as a gift I had not asked for. The cold came in earnest in the middle of December, and it came the way the worst cold always does in that country, not as a storm a man can see and dread, but as a stillness. The wind that hounded the coulee all fall simply stopped, and the sky went a hard, pale color like skimmed milk, and the temperature fell out from under the territory like a floor giving way. The first morning of it, I went to the door, and the air took the breath out of me and turned it to ice on the wool at my collar before it had fully left my mouth, and the seep water that ran even in August had gone silent under a lid of ice, and the whole coulee stood so still that I could hear my own blood. In Granger they were saying 30 below by the second week, and then colder, and the stage stopped running, and the freight stopped, and the mercury in the one good thermometer at the Mercantile was said to have sat below the figures on the glass for 9 days running, and Harlan Voss sat by his stove and was for once not heard from. I knew none of this at the time. I knew my own small numbers. I knew that my chamber held at a temperature where the water barrel never skinned over more than a finger of ice by morning, that the clay walls a foot back from the fire stayed dry and almost warm to the hand, that a fire of 3 split logs banked under ash at night would still hold a live coal at dawn, because the stone gave back all night what it had taken all day, the heat moving out of the rock so slow and so steady that I never once woke to a cold hearth in the whole of that winter. Outside, the very ground cracked with frost in the dark like a rifle going off, and the trees down the dry creek split with a sound like an axe blow, and Gristle would lift his head at each report and then lay it down again, and sleep stretched out and easy on the warm stone, while not 2 miles off men were burning their chairs. I had cut into the hill 12 feet, and 12 feet of earth does not care what the air above it does. My father had told me that, on the washbank, with his cracked hand on my wrist, I had believed him the way you believe a thing you have not yet had to bet your life on. I was betting my life on it now, 3 logs at a time, and the hill was paying out. What I did not know, what no one in the coulee knew until later, was that the cold was not the only thing that had come down out of the north that December. There were men loose in the country that winter, 4 of them, what was left of a band that had robbed the Overland paymaster near South Pass and scattered ahead of a posse into the broken ground, and the broken ground they scattered into was mine. I learned their number and their names long after, the way you learn the shape of a danger once it has passed over you. That December, I knew only that Gristle began to wake in the night and stand, stiff-legged at the door, with the hair lifted along his spine, looking at the banked snow over the window as if he could see through it, and that twice I heard horses in the coulee in the small hours, slow and searching, and the murmur of men who did not want to be heard. The first time I lay still in the dark with my hand on the dog's neck, and my heart going like Posy's hooves on stone, and I understood, in the cold, clean way you understand things at such an hour, that a woman alone in a house those men could find would not see the spring. And then I understood the second thing, the gift I had not asked for. They could not find the house. They rode within 40 feet of my door in the dark and saw a hillside. I lived a strange double winter after that, and I will tell it plainly because the plain telling is the only honest one. By day the cold was my enemy and the earth was my friend, and the two of them fought it out across the front wall of my house while I tended the fire and rationed the cornmeal and kept Gristle close. By night a different enemy rode the coulee, and the same earth that held my warmth hid my smoke and swallowed the small light of my window and made of my home a thing the eye slid off of, exactly as it had slid off of it in October when I banked the snow without a thought of any man but the ones who mocked me. The outlaws were quartered somewhere up the dry creek in a line shack they had broken into, I learned afterward, and they spent the worst weeks of that winter doing what men do when they are cornered and cold and afraid, which is search and circle and grow desperate. They were looking for the homesteads they knew dotted that country, for the food and the fire and the fresh horses a homestead holds. And they were not finding much, because that winter had emptied the country ahead of them. They found the Dawes place abandoned and stripped it of what little had been left. They found the old Lindquist dugout, the original one he had dug and then abandoned for his fine frame house, and it was empty. They quartered a coulee they had every reason to believe held a single woman in her stores. A coulee the whole of Granger could have told them held the cut girl and her mule and her dog, and they could not find her because she had built her walls out of the hill itself and let the snow finish the work, and there is no door to kick in a house that has no face. I think on it still the strangeness of those weeks, how the very thing the town had mocked, the way my house disappeared into the ground, was the thing that hid me from men who would have done me harm, so that a girl was kept safe by the exact feature that had been named her foolishness. The earth had made it so as a gift I had not asked for, and did not at first understand, and it asked nothing of me in return, but that I keep my smoke quiet and my lamp low, and trust the ground the way my father had taught me to trust it. I will not pretend I was not afraid. I was 19 and alone, and I slept with the axe within reach of my hand, and I did not like the fire bright on. The nights I heard them, and I learned to bake my cornbread at midday so the smoke would lift and thin in the bright cold air and not stand against a dark sky like a finger pointing down at me. Cora Pratt had taught me that without meaning to, telling me of her father on the Platte, that a dugout smoke is its only tongue and a careful man keeps it quiet. I kept it quiet. Gristle and I passed those nights with the lamp turned low to a bead, listening to horses that did not know we were 10 feet from them through 2 feet of stone and 12 of frozen hill. And in the daytime, when the cold drove the riders to their shack, I went on living the small, ordinary life of a person keeping warm, and the strangeness of it was a thing I have never been able to fully give to anyone who was not there. Down in Granger, they thought I was likely dead in my fool's burrow. Up the coulee, 4 armed men thought the coulee was empty, and between those two wrong beliefs, I sat at my warm stone hearth and fed my dog the rind of the bacon and waited for the country to thaw. The cold broke the others before it broke me. That was the arithmetic of that winter, and it is the arithmetic that matters most, because a house is not finally a thing you praise or mock. It is a thing that is measured against the cold and the dark in dead men and living ones. The Haggans, who farmed the bench above the coulee, and had laughed as loud as anyone from the safe distance of their frame house, burned their fence rails, and then their furniture, and then a portion of their barn, and lost their milk cow and a horse to the cold, and the youngest of them came near to losing his feet, and kept them only because his mother thawed them slow against her own body for 2 days. The Dawes family, whose abandoned house the Outlaws stripped, had left in November for the wife's people in Rawlins, and got caught on the road by the first hard freeze and survived in a snow cave they dug in a drift, which is the same principle as my house, earth against the cold, dug in panic by people who would have called my deliberate version of it madness a month before. Old Lindqvist did not survive. He was found in the spring, sitting upright at his cold stove with his hands in his lap, in a stoutly built frame house with 8 windows and not 1 foot of earth banked against it. A house any man in Granger would have called sound. 8 windows and a fine plank floor and a man frozen at his own hearth, and up the coulee, in a hole in the hill that the whole county had named, a grave. A girl of 19 and her dog came through the deepest cold anyone there could. Remember without losing so much as a toe on 3 logs a night in the patient honesty of the ground. The thaw came late that year, in a sudden run of warm wind off the southwest in the 3rd week of March that rotted the snow in a matter of days and turned the coulee to red mud, and with the thaw the country opened up again, and men began to move and to count their losses and their dead. The Outlaws were taken on the open ground east of the cut on the first clear day, the posse from South Pass having waited out the same winter and come down fresh on tired, desperate men, and there was no great battle to it. Only 4 cold, thin men giving up their guns in the mud, glad almost to be caught and warm. I watched it from my doorway with Gristle at my knee, the snow gone off the front wall now, so that my stone face showed bare and plain in the sun. A house at last and not a swell in the hill, and one of the posse riders saw me standing there where no house was supposed to be and pulled up his horse and stared at me the way you would stare at a person who had walked out of a grave, which in a manner of speaking I had. The one who came up the coulee a week later was not a posse rider. It was Harlan Voss. He came on a borrowed horse because 2 of his own had died in the cold, and he came up the muddy track to the cut with his hat in his hand in a way I had never seen him hold it. And he stopped his horse at the bottom of my spoil bank and looked a long time at the stone face and the slant flue with its clean thread of smoke and the banked earth and the small east window catching the morning, and at me standing in the door of the thing he had named a grave from the steps of his mercantile. He had ridden up, I think, to say something arranged, the way he arranged his opinions on the porch. Whatever it was, he did not say it. He sat his borrowed horse in the mud and was quiet for a long while. Gristle watched him. The seep water ran somewhere under the snow with a small sound, and then Harlan Voss, who had never in my hearing admitted to being wrong about a load of freight or the weather, or the worth of a human soul, took off his hat the rest of the way and said the only thing there was to say. He said, "You read the ground." That was all. 4 words, and his voice broke on the last of them, not from the cold. I did not answer him. There was nothing to answer. He had spent the winter by a stove that ate his fence and his furniture, and was not enough, in a town that had buried Lindqvist out of a sound frame house, and he had ridden up a coulee to a hole in a hill that he had laughed at, and he had found it warm, and he had found me alive in it, and the whole arrangement of opinions he had carried so comfortably in front of him, for so long had come down all at once, the way unshored ground comes down, silently and completely, and without any drama at all. He sat there with his hat in his 2 hands. The borrowed horse shifted under him and blew a long plume of breath into the thawing air, and somewhere below us the seep had come back to life and was running again over the ice, with a small bright sound, and Gristle rose from where he lay and walked a few steps toward the horse, and then simply sat in the mud between us, looking up at the man, and Harlan looked down at the dog for a long moment, as if the dog too were a thing he had been wrong about. The sun was full on the stone face by then, and the steam was lifting off the wet rock where the morning warmed it, so that the whole front of my house seemed to breathe. None of us spoke into that. I have learned that the largest moments of a life are nearly always quiet, that the world does not announce them, that a man's whole understanding can turn over inside him, while a horse breathes and a creek runs, and a dog sits down in the mud, and nothing at all appears to happen. After a while he asked, in a low voice, with the porch all gone out of it, how I had known the smoke would not show at night, and whether the slant of the flue was a thing I could teach a man, and whether, when the ground was fit to dig, I would come and show him where on his own, played out, quarter a man might cut in against the cold for the next winter. I told him I would. I had no revenge in me. I had never had any. The cold had settled the account more completely than any bitterness of mine ever could, and a man humbled and asking is worth more to a country than a man broken and gone. My father had taught me that too on the washbank with his honest cracked hands. Word went down the coulee and then through Granger and then, the way such things travel, out across that whole stretch of territory, that the cut girl had wintered in a hole in the hill while sound houses froze, and by the next autumn I was not digging alone. Cora Pratt was the first to ask for the boarding house, and I cut her a long earth-backed room behind the kitchen that held its warmth on a quarter of the wood she had burned before, and she sat in it that next January with her feet near a small fire and her hands quiet in her lap, and said her father on the Platte would have wept to see it, that he had carried the knowing of it to his grave because nobody would listen, and that she was glad somebody had finally been fool enough not to care who laughed. Then the Hagans came, Tunis Hagen, who would not stable a hog in such a hole, with his hat in his hands the way Harlan had come, and his wife behind him, who had thawed her boy's feet against her own body for 2 days, and I did not say a word about the hog, and I showed them how to read their own bench above the coulee, for the hard seam and the soft, where the sandstone ran close enough to the surface to roof a chamber, and where it dove too deep to trust. The thing the county had named a grave got a new name as the years went on, an honest one, a builder's name. Hill House and Bank House and the Cut, and men who had never met me, built their houses into their hillsides from Granger to the Sweetwater, and beyond, and called the method by the plain name of the work and not by my name at all, which was as it should be, because the knowing was never mine to begin with. It was my father's, and his trades before him, and the earth's before that, and all I had done was carry it through one winter to where other hands could take it up. I will tell you the truest thing I learned, and then I will let it be. A house copied from the outside does not hold. More than one man took only the look of mine, dug a shallow scrape and set a stone face on it, and banked no earth and slanted no flue and sounded no roof and was cold, and blamed the method instead of his own haste because he had taken the form and not the principle, and the principle was the only part that ever mattered. The ones who understood why the ground held the heat built warm houses for 50 years. The ones who only copied the shape built cold ones and gave it up. Understanding, not imitation, is the inheritance that lasts. I lived to be an old woman in that country, and I outlived Harlan Voss, who became, of all the unlikely things, my friend and my best pupil, and the man who at the county fair would tell anyone who stood still long enough about the winter. He froze in a sound house while a girl he had mocked sat warm in a hill, telling it against himself every time, which is a rarer and finer thing than never having been wrong. He dug 3 houses with his own hands before his knees gave out, and the last of them he cut for a young couple who had nothing, the way I had nothing, and he would take no money for it. And he told them at the door what I had told him in the mud, that they were to learn the why of it, and not only the how, or the cold would find the difference. I outlived Cora Pratt, who left me the boarding house and is buried under a stone I cut and set into the hillside myself, facing the morning. I never married and never wanted to, and I never went hungry or cold again, and the mule Posey lived to a great age in a pasture below the house, and Gristle slept by my hearth for 11 more winters, and is buried at the foot of the front wall where the morning sun off the east window warms the ground first of anywhere on the place. People ask me sometimes, the young ones who came later to see the old hill houses, whether I was not afraid that winter, alone with the outlaws searching and the cold pressing in, and I told them the truth, that I was afraid every single night, and that fear and knowing are not enemies, that a person can be afraid in her body and certain in her hands at the very same hour, and that the certainty is the older and the deeper of the two. If you have been given it by someone who loved you, if you go to that country now, a long while after all of it, you can still find the houses if you know how to look, which most people do not, because a house built into a hill is a house the eye slides off of, and that was always half its virtue. You will be walking a dry coulee, thinking the land is empty, and you will see, if the light is right and the smoke is up, a thread of gray standing out of what you took for a bare red hillside. And under it, if you go close, a stone face weathered the color of the ground it grew out of, and a slant of flue drawing clean, and you will understand all at once that the hill is keeping someone warm and has been keeping someone warm since before your grandfather was born. My own house still stands. I am told the family in it now does not know who cut the first chamber back into that seam of clay below the sandstone shelf, and I find I do not mind because the warmth does not need my name to do its work, any more than the earth needed my praise to hold its heat. The winter, the outlaws searched the coulee and found a hillside, and the cold came for everyone, and the ground I had read kept what the houses with faces could not. The hill keeps it still. It will keep it after I am gone. That was the whole of the inheritance, and it was enough.